Hi, everybody. Yes. You've lasted all day today. Congratulations. And you're not asleep. I have to admit one thing right off the bat is I'm not at liberty to say anything about my company. He said the name, so ignore that. I cannot confirm nor deny that I work at that company. I can't tell you anything about the project. And that's because we are a startover in Central Oregon. Oh, a startover is a startup that was founded and run by graybeards. So we are too close to shipping to, my boss is far more paranoid than I am. He doesn't understand this community, and he doesn't understand that you're not a threat to him commercially, but he is the boss, so I had to just yank everything out, and I don't need it in my talk. The other thing I want to do is I want to make I love this theater. This reminds me of the Black Swan at Oregon Shakespeare Festival. Anybody been to that theater? Oh, you've got to go to that theater. This is really intimate. I won't spit on you because that's what happened to me when I was in the Black Swan. The actors were spitting on me. But I do want to make this a little more intimate, a little more dynamic. But the most important thing is I don't want it to stay down in the details that you have been swimming in all day. We're going to go up and out. All right? Okay, so my name, Michael Corning. My past experience is checkered. I've been debating what I should mention about my past experience. So I think what I will do is kind of take a lesson from the previous speakers. I'll talk about the three things that I've done in the past that has anything to do with what I want to talk about today. And the only reason I want to do that is because I need you to have some confidence in what I'm about to tell you. I'm going to try, well, actually, I'm not technically going to try to persuade you, but I am certainly going to take the first step toward persuading you. And I can't persuade you if you don't trust my credentials. All right. The first is that I wrote the first book on active server pages 20 years ago in January. Anybody know what active server pages are? Okay. Did anybody read that book? I was still, how about that? Congratulations, come see me afterwards. I went from civilian to Microsoft the week before that book published. So I'm in a support role because nobody knows what ASP is. So I'm talking to one of my customers and he says, yeah, I just have this photocopy of this active server pages book. And I said, oh, really? You printed out the whole book in a photocopy? It would have been much cheaper to buy it. And then I told him who I was. And he was awfully embarrassed, but it was okay. So active server pages was my first. XML was my second. So I wrote about 3 or 4 books on XML for ROX. And I gave a talk at the first ROX Web Developers Conference in either 99 or 2000. I can't remember. It was around the presidential elections. Because after I was done, and the very last thing I talked about on my third and last talk of that conference was how programmers can abolish poverty on this planet in this generation. And that struck a nerve, because after I was done, I was walking out in the hallways. I had people packed all the way. They were sitting up here, like right next to me. They were all the way into the back. And when I walked outside the hallway, they were saying, Corning for president. And this is in Washington, D.C., so it's kind of appropriate. So I know that there's something in your psyche that responds to that. I know you want to change the world. I want you to expand your idea of what the world is. Now, that was 17 years ago that I gave that talk. Today, a lot of things have happened. You've heard a lot of that news breaking here in this conference. If I was convinced 20 years ago that programmers could abolish poverty on this planet in this generation, I am far more convinced, and I'm going to show you specific examples today of how that is going to happen. This is not optional. Dave was saying before that it's really hard to get developers to change. Yet, when you look back over the last 50 years, they've always changed. Now, they've gone kicking and screaming, but they've always changed because there is nothing you can do about this. These technology innovations, these inflection points are always going to happen. Forever, they're going to happen. And we've just kind of begrudgingly got on with that project. But in this particular case, oops, this is not my laptop. So the first thing I want to do, as any good author would do, is I've got 8 terms that are really important for you to understand. I don't use these terms casually. I've spent, since I picked up the first one, the definition of asset, when I taught finance at Portland State, which is the other thing in my past that is relevant to talk today. And I spent the first 5 minutes of every session in college there teaching, asking students a question that didn't have anything necessarily to do with finance for 5 minutes just to get them warmed up. So one of my favorite questions, which was a little closer to finance, but you'll see in the answer, it is not finance, is what's the definition of an asset? You guys are finance management students. What's the definition of an asset? How can you compute the capital asset pricing model or your return on equity or anything else if you don't know what an asset is. And I didn't know what an asset was. So we dialogued with this for maybe 6 months. And we finally came up with this elegant and simple definition, which turns out to apply to anything, including everything you saw at this conference so far. Every single thing you saw here was an asset. Because, as Mike said in his talk, it's anything that allows you to do something you couldn't do before. Your role, Mike also asked, why do you do software? Well, I have my own answer. First, because you can't help it. But two, there is something that you do that extends the power of human beings. Do you have any idea how responsible you are? What kind of responsibility that is? You are literally extending the capability of every single human being. The thing that I want to get across to you today is stop thinking about yourself. Stop thinking about the existing companies that you have, the existing projects that you're on, your other fellow programmers. You're not going to change the world that way. You're going to change the world by impacting everybody else, especially people that don't have computers today. All right? So this is a moral imperative. So the second term that's really important here is capability. I hate features. The word feature is an F word to me. I would go around Microsoft and I would scold people who use the word feature. It was much more important because the definition of a successful Microsoft developer was summation F. Right? You are successful to the extent that you added one more feature to a product that nobody's ever going to use. That was the definition of success. That is a waste of human resources. If you had focused instead on what can I do today to increase the human capability, you would never be out of business. You would never have to wonder, was this the right thing for me to do? So a capability, and this is the capability and ability are duals. You can't talk about one without the other. And then there's a third component that makes those two things work together. A capability is an ability that you can't take for granted. Now let that sink in. A capability is an ability that you cannot take for granted, you being the developer. You're going to put a capability now into your software. You're going to make the human race more capable. All right? You can't take that for granted. An ability is a capability that you can take for granted. In other words, the abilities you have today were capabilities in the past. And yet, they became the normal. And here's the difference. There's a probability distance between an ability at any given time and a capability at any given time. If you try to push the capability too high, too fast, it'll never stick. Have you ever had a really good idea and you couldn't understand why nobody could understand why you had such a good idea? Well, that was a probabilistic difference between where they were today and where you wanted to get them. Dave had that same talk a few minutes ago. Okay, so that's the first. Those are the four terms that I've basically developed over the last 20 years. The other four terms come from my favorite authors, two of which are friends of mine. Chris Alexander. Everybody in the room knows Chris Alexander, right? No? Really? Design patterns? Software design patterns? Okay. Chris Alexander was an architect. He got the first PhD in architecture from Harvard. It took Harvard 300 years to have a PhD program for architects. Chris got that, and he had this design pattern, the timeless way of building, and a pattern language and the Oregon experiment, where those were his books that tried to convey what he was trying to get across to architects about what makes good architecture and what makes bad architecture. What makes architecture live, what makes architecture the kind of place that draws people to it instead of pushes people away. Well, that sentiment stuck with the developers, software developers, and they took the ball and ran with that. In fact, is Jon in here? Jon Gosselin in here? No? Okay. Jon we're going to get to this in a minute. I guess I should. Does that mean 24 minutes left? Okay, then I have to go a little faster. Let me start over again. So we have design. Design is the reconciliation of forces in a context. That's what Chris Alexander is telling us. Context is the key word there. You have to understand the context that you're in at any time. Context is everything. Everything else derives from understanding context. If you screw up a project, it's probably not because you're not smart enough. It's probably not because you're not skilled enough as a programmer. It's because you didn't understand the context you were operating in. You didn't understand, you couldn't list the forces that were at work in that context. And you couldn't show how you reconciled those forces. You will see this in work in your daily life, in all places. You will see it all over the place, especially in the natural world. I have a John Deere tractor. I love my tractor because I have 2 ponies. And my ponies produce 50 pounds of poop a day. Okay? I got to do something with that stuff. Well, it turns out that's not hard at all. You just let nature do its thing. The hardest thing for me is starting the tractor at 26 below zero. That takes an extra heater. But once I get that stuff moving, nature takes over. It has already reconciled all the forces. So what happens with this hay that I put into the pony's mouth comes out as poop, and then it sits over here in a pile for 6 months, and when it's done, it smells so good. You haven't smelled anything that good until you've put your hand in a pile of pony poop that has been properly decomposed. And all I have to do is turn it 3 times a week, right? I have to keep it at 160 degrees, no more than 160 degrees, otherwise I kill all the animals inside that are making that good smell. Right? That's what I'm talking about. You will see that kind of relationship all over your life, in your personal life, in your physical life, in your professional life. Okay, 3 other terms that are important. Software. Anybody know Phil Armour? Does anybody know the 5 orders of ignorance? Okay, 5 orders of ignorance. The 5th order of ignorance, they're zero-based, so this is order 4, is there are 5 orders of ignorance. So we just took that one off the list. The 0 order of ignorance is there's an absence of ignorance. That's knowledge. What's in between? 1st order ignorance. I know what I don't know. That's what you guys deal with all the time. Developers deal there. What's 2nd order ignorance? Take a guess. Yes, I don't know what I don't know. I am ignorant of my ignorance. I'm clueless. Here's the tricky one. What's 3rd order ignorance? 3OI. It's actually 4th order, but it's 3OI. No, not quite. You don't know that there is a system by which you can move from 2nd order to 1st order to 0. There's a process that gets you there. Now again, all of you have been doing this for your whole career. How many testers have I got in the room? I must be on a different planet. I don't. Okay, testers were Armour was right. Testers were the one part of the development community that didn't consciously get this, but did it every day. Software testing is the process by which you move from 2nd order to 1st order to 0. Your testers are really, really, really important. It's really ironic for me that after 19 years at Microsoft, on basically the day I left, 2 things happened. 1, the stock price hit 50, which is what I wanted it to hit before I left, and I waited 10 years for that. And 2, Microsoft sent home all their testers, me included. That was a mistake. Software testing is really important. I got a clue today from my old comrades at Microsoft. I think what Microsoft is doing is that they're farming out the test to vendors. Good, great, fine. They don't have to work inside of Microsoft. In fact, it's probably better if they don't. So the same thing with you guys. If you don't have really good test resources, you're going to get stuck in the 2nd order of ignorance. There's another problem with 2nd order ignorance. Since you don't know what you don't know, how many people know how to say when they're done? My boss does this to me all the time. When are you going to be done? Does anybody give their boss a confident answer to that question every time it's asked? Anybody? Yeah, it's remember that scene in Agony and the Ecstasy? Charlton Heston is up there painting the Sistine Chapel, and the Pope is down below, and he goes, "When are you going to be done?" And he looks down and he goes, "When it's finished." You don't know. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. You can't say when I'm done if you're in 2nd order ignorance. Okay? So there's a second piece of process that helps you get out of 2nd to 1. And we talked about that here today. There's other things in Agile that help you do that. One of the things that Agile taught me, there's only 2 that Agile taught me. One was, when am I done? To at least write it down. You might not be right, but until that moment, I didn't even know that was a legitimate question. And the second thing that Agile taught me was, defer your decisions to the last responsible moment. And one of the reasons, I don't think they really necessarily tie that to 2nd order ignorance, but one of the reasons that that's important is because as much you reduce 2nd order ignorance with time. So the more time you have, the more 2nd order ignorance you're going to reduce. Now the trick is to get your managers to understand that. The trick is to get them to cooperate with you. I can't go any more deep than that because I only have 19 minutes, but the other 2 things are again, relevant to the main argument I want to make today. The other thing that Armour said was that software is not a product. You've heard that somewhat in different talks here today. But Armour was very specific. He said software is a repository of knowledge. And software development is a knowledge acquisition process. Software development is moving from second-order ignorance to zero-order ignorance. That's it. That's what it's for. So if you have two roles now as programmers. One is you're going to be that part of the human race, which consciously or not, is moving from second-order to zero-order ignorance. And at the same time, and to the extent that you're successful, you are increasing the capacity and the capability of the human being. Huge responsibility. Last thing is measurement. Can somebody give me, without reading the slide, can somebody give me a definition of measurement? Ask a different question. I asked that to Mike last night. And when I told him the answer, he said, no, that's why we measure. So do you have any idea why we measure? Think about this. You heard measurement talked about here today.
So you can know when you're done.
That is one. That's one. But there's something even more important than being done. Because, as Da Vinci said about art is never done, only abandoned. All right? Software is the same thing. Software is never done, only abandoned. I use that argument with my boss, and I've decided that's a very bad idea, so don't follow my lead. He does not want to hear that. It's true, but he doesn't want to hear that. Okay? Measurement is a set of observations that reduce uncertainty. If you look back at every meaningful measurement you ever took, I'll bet you would find that that's exactly what that measurement did for you. Every single time. But not anybody in here knew the definition of measurement like that. Yeah. Reduce the uncertainty. So you measure the first time, and at my age, speaking of which, I can say pretty confidently that I am the oldest guy at the show. I know I beat Dave by 10 years. And I thought he was as old as I was, so I know I'm ancient. Anyway, so we have measurement as a set of observations that reduce uncertainty. All right, now let's go on to two more things that I want to share with you. The reason I'm giving you this kind of information, these are not takeaways, but these are things that you can go back and look on your own time. I've spent 20 years with these ideas. I'm not expecting you to get it in 35 minutes. But this stuff is written down. This stuff is part of the human understanding of life right now. If you can go back in and take a look at these things with fresh eyes in your business, it will change the way you think about your business. All right? Tyler Volk, one of my favorite authors. And I think he's at Columbia, in New York. He wrote a book called Meta Patterns. And I'm a patterns guy. So I love meta patterns. And my favorite chapter was his chapter on holarchies. So I wrote to him and says, Tyler, I really like your chapter on holarchies. And he says, that was my favorite chapter too. Because as I was writing it, I kept writing and writing and writing. It just kept opening up. And I've found that exact same thing happening in my life, even to this day. A couple of days ago, when I was prepping these slides, I was reading the David Bohm reference there. In that reference, he talks about this idea that David has. He's a quantum physicist who died in 92, I think. But he had this idea of quantum mechanics, an ontological interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's the only interpretation of quantum mechanics I ever had any chance of understanding. But he's talking about he talks about order, right? And quantum mechanics was a shift in order. You heard Dave a minute ago talking about what is basically a shift in order. Every time that this community has changed, every time it has negotiated an inflection point, that was a change in order. That's what's happening now. Right this minute, in this room, there's an inflection point happening. And I'm more convinced than ever because I've been here for a day. I was convinced about this before I came to Austin, but I'm more convinced than ever before. So here's the key thing. It's very simple, but it's very hard to do. If you want to understand order, you want to take two things, you want to see how they are different with respect to the rest of the world. So how are they similar? And then after you've established that, you ask, how are these two things different? You answer those two questions consistently, and you will have defined order. But that's only the first step. This article talks also about context and structure. And what you guys are dealing with right now in the dark, literally, if we turn these lights off, you'd be just as well off as you are right now. You're groping in the dark. We're all groping in the dark. We're all immersed in second-order ignorance trying to figure out how to make this happen. But back to Tyler, because this is going to be relevant to the next slide. In this idea of holarchies are like hierarchies, except there's one really important difference. The two elements of a holarchy are both wholes and parts at the same time, right? Very Zen, yes? They're wholes and parts at the same time. It depends on the context. So if you really want to understand, especially complex systems, holarchies are perfect for that because they're not rigid. Hierarchies get in the way almost immediately. Holarchies have some of the characteristics of hierarchies because there's layers, but the layers, the elements of the layers are not fixed parent-child. As much as I love my mom, I'm never going to be her mom or her dad. I'm fixed at being her child, but not with holons and clonons. Okay, so let's take a look at what. Oh yeah, so this is one of those things that has occurred to me in the last 48 hours. I was finishing this slide and I read that paper and I had to go back and add that little bullet point there, that if you read this paper that is back here, you're going to be able to see a whole bunch of new things out of these basic ideas that I've only got a few minutes to expose to you today. Here's my version of the old order. So let me go switch gears from the academic to the practical. So after 19 years at Microsoft, I was working with a nonprofit in Oregon, and I founded the nonprofit, and that nonprofit was working with a commercial company, the one that I can't talk about. So one of the things that I decided to do, and my wife wasn't very happy, I gave her a double whammy that day. I said, honey, I'm not going to work at Microsoft anymore, and I'm going to go into startup. Oh, no, not good. My wife wanted to come to Sisters, Oregon to retire, not to get into a startup mentality. But I did it anyway, and bless her heart, she stayed with me all this time. So we decided we were going to take, this was January 2016. I didn't know how to spell AWS. I didn't know what it was. I'm a Microsoft guy, and I'm a Steve Ballmer kind of imprinted guy too, so I can't even hold an iPhone without getting hives because I think he's going to be behind me screaming at me. But in any case, the only thing that I could do was stay with the community I had so many years with, and that was fine. I'd started working with Azure the first day it shipped, but nothing in real time and for a product until January of 2016. And all the years that I worked at Microsoft, I never built a product. Didn't need to. I was in skunkworks. My job was to go sneak around to all these different organizations and do things nobody else thought of doing or wanted to do. Had nothing to do with the product, but had everything to do with usually making testers better. So anyway, we have this business that we want to start. So we decided to do it the conventional way. And another colleague from Microsoft and I started at the same time. I went into building the UI, and this is where Jon Gosselin gets to be blamed a little. Jon is the father of MVVM, Model View View Model, a design pattern. When I tried to build the UI in the first 3 months of 2016, I was a disciple of Gosselin's work. So I wanted to make sure all my UI stuff would pass muster if Jon ever got his hands on it. I spent a lot of time on that and then no time at all on what my customer needed. But by God, I was going to have software that fit the MVVM model. One of the reasons I needed that was because the MVVM model collapses second-order ignorance into at least first-order ignorance. And there are some times when I would write code and I go, this is violating the principle. I don't know how to make it right, but I know it's violating the principle. That's way different than having code and you don't know that you violated a principle, and then you can't figure out why it doesn't work. Because you violated this principle up here. If you knew what the principle was, you wouldn't have this problem. Well, even when you know the principles, it doesn't mean you're always going to write code consistent with the principles. Aristotle said knowing what to do and doing it are entirely different things. All right, so I've got this UI base, and after 3 months, one of our customers says, you know, I don't need a UI. In fact, I don't even want a UI. I have enough UIs. I want your service to work with all the other services that I've got. So we thought, all right. So I dropped the ball in March, and we switched over to this other way of interacting with our customer. And at the same time, in those first 3 months, my colleague was building the REST APIs and getting all the web API stuff in Azure going so that you had your basic infrastructure in place. Now, on the one hand, after 6 months of this kind of work, we both marveled at how two people with our backgrounds could produce so much stuff. The only problem was what we produced had no bearing on the customer. But boy, we were sure happy with the software. We were amazed at how much productivity we get out of Azure. So after about 6 months of that, I thought, you know what, this isn't going to work. We need to get to time to market is everything with the startup or a start over, especially with a start over. Because this is the only chance the start over gets, by the way. If you think it's stressful to be in a startup, try being in a start over. This is our last shot. So we don't get another shot at this. So I decided I was going to have to do something about that. So I left James to continue to work on his use of Azure Queues and Azure Table Storage. He takes this essential intel from our customer, he splits it out, part of it goes to table storage, part of it's all time-based, it's all a matter of timeouts. So he was using queue storage and web jobs and all that stuff to build basically handcraft a state machine. And I'm not sure that state machine works consistently even today. And it's certainly not easy to extend. If it does work, it only works in one nice little sandbox. And it freaks me out too, because the other day he said, I sent a reply in the text, I said, wait, and it didn't work. And I said, it's supposed to wait. And he goes, it's not in the spec. I freaked out. I composed myself and I didn't go crazy, but I just put a little notch in the gun that says, no, you can't talk about some developers with respect to what the customer needs first. They're protecting their butt by saying, if it's not in the spec, I'm not going to do it. That is not agile. That's not the way I want to work. So I switched gears and I said, all right, I'm going to start over. I got nothing to lose at this point. And so when I did, come on. Oh, yeah. Right there. So what I did at this time is I switched over to Azure Functions. That was my first foray. I didn't know what serverless was. I barely knew what an Azure function was. I did know that I could write the code in a browser. I didn't need Visual Studio, which takes 15 minutes to launch, takes all the memory out of my laptop, so I can't use video, you know, and has so many capabilities that I don't need. I've switched over to Visual Code now because it doesn't have any of that overhead. But in any case, I had to start with Azure Functions, and I had this, in fact, going back 20 years, the first time I wrote an ASP page, I'm actually basically typing in Notepad. I'm coding in Notepad like I did back then. So there's no IntelliSense, there's no debugging, there's no nothing. But I had tiny little functions, like 6 lines of code that did whatever I needed to do. And I didn't have to worry about any of the boilerplate that is also always attached to all the stuff that we have to do with all the big development stuff Microsoft gives the professional developer. Underscore professional developer, because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So what did it end up looking like? The other thing that happened, this was really interesting. This is why I know that we're in an emerging inflection point. There were more than one occasion. In fact, Jeff, and thank you, Jeff. Jeff is from Microsoft. He's the guy that asked me to come and share my story with you guys. But there was more than one occasion when I would ask for something. I'd say, I gotta need this. Like in Power Apps, I needed to have regular expression support so I could validate phone numbers. I asked for that on Friday. It shipped on Monday. Now, it's just an accident, maybe, but that's how quickly this company is now responding, not necessarily to my request on Friday, but they're always giving me those things. They know ahead of time what I need, and they're giving it to me just about at the same time that I've asked for it. So a lot of what I could do today, I could not have done 3 months ago because the product hadn't gone GA, general availability. I'm loath to make production quality software on preview quality infrastructure. So everything we're using today is GA, but it's happened just as I've needed it. So here's another thing. We have not talked about UI very much in the serverless world. Does anybody know what Power Apps are? Again, I'm in that other planet. So Power Apps is, think about Power Apps as a UI platform that works like Excel. Everything Dave said about Excel applies to Power Apps. They're functions. Your UIs are all a collection of functions. And some of those functions can call out a logic app. And some of those functions can call out other functions. So what my Power Apps do now is that they're just a very thin-skinned UI. One of the problems we have in a business, and my boss is freaking out, is he says, wait, you've locked me down into Power Apps. So if you don't have Office 365, you can't use our product. And I go, that's true. But I have 84 million people on the planet that use Office 365. What bigger audience do you want? Right? So nail that audience first before you worry about anybody else. So I have that to deal with. That's a business consequence from a technology decision that was made. But because Power Apps is like Excel, and I can write UIs really, really quickly, I can experiment like everybody's been telling you, like Mike said today. I can write code in real time with my retired police officers that are my intermediate customer. While I'm typing, he's telling me what to do, and I'm just changing it, just like a spreadsheet. I'm embarrassed at how simple it is to make a UI with Power Apps. But I didn't want to add the extra layer of the CDS, the Common Data Service at the bottom. That's a new available asset that Microsoft provides that lets you put all the data that you need to worry about, whether it's from your business or from BI or in our business, a whole bunch of other sources, Internet of Things kind of stuff, it all goes into one common data service, and then whether it's Power BI or Power Apps or Logic Apps or Azure Functions, they all go to that particular store to get the data. I didn't want to attach that to the Power Apps on the client. I wanted to make that a thin client. So now I have that. Now I send a message over to Logic Apps. Logic Apps has access to everything. It has access to all my CDS stuff, all my Azure Functions, and it has another Power Apps connector. So that other Power Apps connector, that's inside our business. So I can attach CDS to that without any cost, without any overhead to the customer. And that box there on the right, that's the one that is our business. So everything on this diagram, one of the nice things about it is everything on this diagram is about the business. And almost nothing on the previous diagram was about the business. So I can get to shipping state far faster. I had to collapse the wave function a little bit. I had to say, no, I am not going to write this explicitly for 4 different platforms. By the way, Power Apps runs on all the platforms. It even runs on this silly Windows phone. There's only 2 guys left on the planet that still have a Windows phone. And I refuse to give this up. Just on principle, I refuse to give this up. In any case, but the Power Apps work on here. In fact, this is my canary in the coal mine. If it works on this phone with 750 megabytes of memory, it's going to work on all your phones, which have 5 or 6 gigabytes of memory, right? So that's another lesson. Always don't, this is why it works on developers' desks and nobody else's, because they've got 60 gigabytes of RAM. And their members have 1 megabyte of RAM. It makes a difference. Speaking of megabytes, I'm going to skip over a little bit, but this is another tip here. Oh, by the way, that other question, this one here, according to Genesis 2:9, what was Adam's first job? Say again? Yes. I knew somebody would have the answer to that. All right, so what would Adam call serverless? It's an open question. All right, so that little node right there in the middle, that replaced everything that James did. I built that node in the middle in 2 days. And that's from scratch, not knowing anything about Logic Apps. Because all I did was orchestrate what I needed. I didn't have to go into all those arcane details that James struggles with, to this day continues to struggle with. Those guys are a hell of a lot smarter than me. So I'm going to let them do the heavy lifting. I'm going to look like a genius because I can produce the same kind of code in 2 days. Right? That's closer to what I want to get across to you guys here. I'm going to give you a different scale. Oh, by the way, I'm the closer and you're not leaving, and I know the bar's right there. So in a minute and a half, I'm going to do the same thing I did at that web conference. I'm going to have to collapse like 2 or 3 slides into a minute and a half. But if you want to stick around here just for a few extra seconds after a minute and a half, you can get the story. Otherwise, we'll have to go and finish it next door. All right, so imagine this. Talk about scale. Imagine if you drew a diagram of everything that happened in computers for the first 50 years, from 1945 to 1995. The scale of that diagram would be 15,000 meters, the diameter of the Earth. After the internet, the scale of that diagram collapses to 1 meter. 1 meter, the distance between my shoulder and the end of my finger. From the size of the Earth to that distance. Then the next inflection point, the one we're in now, it dropped another order of magnitude. It is now that high. That's 1 decimeter, 10 centimeters, right there. That's where we are now. That's what's happened. All this power, all this capability has been collapsed into this neutron star of technology. It has such protean power that it is capable of changing the rest of the planet, not just your lives, but everybody else's. Before I leave for the everybody else, I have one provocative insight to offer to you. And this harkens back to my finance days. I suggest that the marginal economic value of serverless IP is approaching 0. Is that good news or bad news? It depends on your context. If it's more important for you to always be typing, it's bad news, because you can't get very much pay for typing anymore. Right? It's commoditized to 0. But if your goal is to increase the capability of the human race, that's the best news you've ever heard. Because now you don't have to spend all this time doing things that have nothing to do with changing the human race. You can go over here and do the important stuff now. No more excuses. Number 2, about your businesses, your existing businesses. How do you have an economic model, a business model, when the intellectual property of your software is approaching 0? Well, the first thing is share it. It doesn't cost you anything to share it. You're already doing that with open source, but now the economics are catching up. Second problem with finance, and this is one of the reasons I think Dave's old dinosaurs have a problem, because if all your costs are variable, you can't lose money. But as soon as you have fixed cost, your sales, your income increases faster than your sales rate. So if you don't have any fixed cost, you're only going to have a linear profit model. It won't be nonlinear, but there's no risk either. So we got all these assets out here, all this fixed cost, and that does have IP. It has IP because you can't easily replace that. Half of the talks here today, or at least Dave's talk, was how are we going to replace all that dinosaur code, all those big balls of mud with something that's more like this? Again, these are open questions. Okay, so one last thing here. This is where it starts to turn into how we can change the planet. Did you all realize that just this year, the IMF has forecast a growth rate on the planet, global growth rate of 3.5%. Now everybody's trying to tell the president that there's no way that he can get the United States to have a 3.5% growth rate. The single biggest component of that growth rate is productivity. In fact, if you want stable prices, you can't do anything but depend on productivity. So what I'm telling you here is we have the ability now at that scale from 15,000 kilometers to 1 meter to 1 decimeter, that has pushed all of that economic energy into this little black hole of capability. All right? Microsoft and all the other companies like that have spent billions of dollars. I remember Steve Ballmer looking at the spreadsheets once years ago, and they told him how much he was going to have to invest to make Azure viable. And he said, these are going out of business numbers. He's right. It was a gigantic risk. And thank God he made that risk. And everybody else at Microsoft since has done it. Because that was the change that made it possible for all of us to be sitting in this room and take advantage of that large S. It didn't even exist 5 years ago. And there it is. Don't waste this opportunity. Start working on this right now. Okay, so the other thing about economics, Michael Spence, Nobel laureate in economics, he says that the most sustainable, dependable source of economic growth, only one thing. It's not the government, it's innovation. Innovation is the single most dependable source of economic growth on the planet. Innovation and productivity are they're Siamese twins. So what's happening now is that we're taking all these new services, like the one that I can't talk about, and I can actually do this alone. One guy can build this surface, and it's global, and it's working for everybody. In fact, you guys, when you finally do hear about it on the Discovery Channel, you go, I was there when that's what he was talking about? Yeah, it's going to be on Discovery. We hope it's going to be on Discovery Channel, and the stuff that we're doing may save your life. That's how important it is to do the kinds of things that we couldn't do 5 years ago or 5 months ago. All right? So if we can tap into that, if we can share this kind of capability with the rest of the planet, not the well-born, not the people that got the silver spoon. All of us have silver spoons in our mouths. But the rest of the planet doesn't. The rest of the planet doesn't know how to code, doesn't know what a type is, never will, and now doesn't need to. If I can write the UI in Power Apps, anybody can write the UI in Power Apps. Okay? This time last year, I was entertaining a delegation from Cameroon in Africa. It blew me away because what they told me they wanted to do was they wanted to build a middle class in their country from scratch on 2 pillars, IT and education. Brilliant. Of course you can do that. That was a year ago. I didn't have any of this in my fingertips a year ago. Now I can go back to the Cameroon government and say, then start here. Start right here. All the infrastructure that you need is already in place. It's ready for you to use it. And I can convert one country in Africa from a developed country to a strong middle class in this generation, easily. And if I can do it in Cameroon, I can do it all over Africa. If I can do it over Africa, I can do it all over South America. I can do it every planet on the country, or in the planet. Every country in the planet. No one cannot take advantage of this. But that's up to us. We're the missionaries. We're the ones that go out there and spread this word. So stop thinking just about your job, just about your career, and start imagining what this world's going to be like when the stuff that you take for granted is now taken for granted by everybody else. I'm done. Thank you.